Let the Bible Speak with your speaker, Brett Hickey.
Welcome to Let the Bible Speak. We are committed to exploring the fundamentals of Scripture, crucial to building faith and producing obedience. But we're also intent on addressing controversial topics other religious programs avoid. We strive to reflect the commitment the Apostle Paul expressed to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20:27. For I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. Do you really care about all Jesus endured to pay your sin debt, to redeem your soul? If so, you will appreciate our study this morning. We pick up where we left off previously with Pilate still vacillating. He knew Jesus was not guilty of the charges leveled by the chief priests and had declared it publicly before the growing mob. But he wrestled with what exactly to do. Luke provides information not recorded by the other gospel writers. A fortuitous release from Pilate's political jam seems to be presenting itself. After declaring their error to the chief priests and crowd, I find no fault in him. We read in Luke 23, verse 5 through 12, but they were the more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Initially, Herod was thrilled to see Jesus. Herod viewed Jesus more as a magician, though, than he did the Messiah. He had long looked forward to seeing him. Certain Jesus would put on a show for him. Not only did Jesus perform no miracles, he refused to dignify Herod's barrage of questions, even with a response. Meanwhile, the rabid rabbis continued their sideshow, vehemently assaulting Jesus with unfounded accusations in hope that Herod would condemn Jesus to death. Herod did not buy their lies, but after exhausting himself and ridiculing Jesus with his soldiers, rather than releasing Jesus as justice demanded, Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. This likely indicates the Pharisees lied when they warned Jesus in Luke 13:31 and 32, that Herod the fox, as Jesus called him, was seeking to kill him. Here, Jesus had been hand-delivered with authorities all but begging for his death, and yet Herod, like Pilate, passes the buck. Perhaps Herod was still haunted by his unwilling participation in the beheading of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. Herod was concerned John the Baptist had come back from the dead as Jesus, Mark 6:16. Herod's final feeble attempt at humor involved sending Jesus back to Pilate in a gorgeous robe. Barnes says this word gorgeous indicated a bright white robe, like that worn by Jewish kings. Back to Pilate for the verdict after our song. Dithering Pilate is once again confronted with doing what is just and setting Jesus free, or violating what little conscience he had left and caving in to the Jewish demands. Pilate gathers himself and flexes his muscles before the Jews once more, asserting in more delicate terms, "You're wrong. Get over it and get out of here." He says in Luke 23, verse 13 through 15, "You present Jesus as a deceiver, as one leading the people astray. I've interrogated him, and so has Herod. Neither of us found him guilty. Your case is flawed." Another opportunity presents itself to Pilate to free himself from this Gordian knot and allow the Jews to save face from the mistake that they were about to make. Pilate had to be thinking, if only I can take the Jews' focus off their frustration with Jesus and redirect them to a positive. The Roman concession of releasing a prisoner of their choice in honor of the Jewish Passover might be just the trick. Mark 15, verse 6 through 9. Now, at the feast, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" Barabbas was the most offensive Jewish prisoner Pilate could find. This notorious prisoner, as we read in Matthew 27, 16 and 17, was a murderer, robber, and as A.T. Robertson says of Mark 15:7, leader of an insurrection or revolution, probably against Rome, and so guilty of the very crime that they tried to fasten on Jesus, who only claimed to be king in the spiritual sense of the spiritual kingdom. Barabbas was everything the Jews accused Jesus of being and more. Only in Barabbas' case, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Barabbas had been chained with his fellow rebels who had committed murder in the rebellion. There is no indication of how many fellow rebels in the text, but some scholars suggest these criminals may have included the two crucified with Jesus. If so, Barabbas may have been intended for the middle cross that day. There is a coincidence in the pairing of Jesus and Barabbas. The name Barabbas literally means son of the Father. In addition, there is evidence Barabbas' first name was Jesus, a common name in that day. Pilate must have thought he had resolved his difficulty by giving them this choice, the vile versus the virtuous. Jesus, Barabbas, son of the Father, or Jesus, the Son of God, which is called the Christ. Pilate was doing an end around the chief priests and appealing to the common sense of the crowd. Mark 15:10, for he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. The battle of wits between Pilate and the chief priests waged on. Meanwhile, we find an unusual interruption recorded in Matthew 27, verse 19. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, Pilate's wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just or righteous man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." This verse is the only Bible mention of Pilate's wife Procula, but perhaps because of her boldness on Jesus' behalf, some hold the unlikely belief she later became a Christian. At any rate, the typical Roman superstition would make her warning a great concern to Pilate and provide further motivation to set Jesus free. Pilate lost the battle with the chief priests, who apparently anticipated Pilate's move and manipulated the crowd. Matthew 27, verse 20 and 21. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes, Mark says, stirred up the crowd, that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They said, Barabbas. Everyone knows the shame and embarrassment of not being picked. But never was an oversight less deserved. Here stands before them one who loves them more than their own mother, one who was willing to die for them. And they favor the most heinous criminal in Jerusalem over him. Matthew 27, verses 22 and 23. Pilate said to them, What then shall I do with Jesus, who was called Christ? They all said to him, Let him be crucified. Then the governor said, Why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, saying, Let him be crucified. Luke 23:22. Then he said to them the third time, Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. Pilate seeks another out, thinking the brutal whipping will assuage their anger. Let's get a feel for the atmosphere of this beating from Mark 15:16. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, or the palace, and they called together the whole garrison, the whole band, the whole cohort. Albert Barnes writes in his commentary, the band or cohort was a 10th part of a Roman legion and consisted of from 400 to 600 men. So many soldiers gathered together. So we see just how public this humiliation was amidst the barbaric soldiers. This brings us to the bulk of the account of Pilate contending with the Jews after the scourging. John 19, verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. According to BibleHistory.com, the Romans would scourge a condemned criminal. The Roman scourge was a short whip made of 2 or 3 leather ropes connected to a handle. Scourging would quickly remove the skin. The leather was knotted with bones or heavy indented pieces of bronze. Sometimes the Roman scourge contained a hook at the end called a scorpion. The criminal was made to stoop, which would make deeper lashes from the shoulders to the waist. He tightened his skin they pulled him around. According to Jewish law, the number of stripes was 40 less 1. Nevertheless, scourging among the Romans was a more severe form of punishment, and there was no legal limit to the number of blows. Deep lacerations, torn flesh. Can you hear the whip? Exposed muscles and excessive bleeding would leave the criminal half dead. Death was often the result of this cruel form of punishment, though it was necessary to keep the criminal alive to be brought to public subjugation on the cross. The centurion in charge would order the lictors to halt the flogging when the criminal was near death. This would be cruel and unusual punishment here, but it too was part of God's plan. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5 and 6 says, But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. The prophet wrote that hundreds of years prior to this whipping. During the monarchies of the 15th and 16th centuries, the English court began having what they called whipping boys. A whipping boy was generally of high status and educated with the prince from birth. Growing up together, the prince and whipping boy became close friends, since the prince did not have many playmates like other children. This bond made the whipping boy, as punishment for a prince, more effective. Because he was royalty, only the king could punish his son for misbehaving or neglecting his studies. Since the king was often absent when the prince needed to be punished, the tutors could whip the prince's friend to punish the prince, since they couldn't whip him, the prince himself. And it was horribly unfair to punish the whipping boy for the error the prince made, but someone had to be punished for the wrongdoing. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Jesus is the best friend you will ever have. And even though in His case, He is the king, He's the one that's royalty, He also became the whipping boy for you and for me. He took the brutal whipping for my sin and for your sin. How much are you willing to endure for Him? John 19, verse 2. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on His head, and they put on Him a purple robe, piercing the brow and scalp in a distinct pattern. More abuse, more pain, more blood, more ridicule. Here He's mimicking Herod's act of dressing Jesus like a king. This was Pilate's idea of justice. Jesus deserved none of it. John 19, verse 3. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck Him with their hands. How can you hit anyone unprovoked, much less the kindest man that ever lived? Mark 15, verse 19. Then they struck Him on the head with a reed and spat on Him. And bowing the knee, they worshiped Him. Oh, they must have had a big laugh over their mock coronation ceremony. But for those who never repented of this wrong, any of their other wrongs, those who never legitimately crowned Jesus King of Kings in this life, the Scriptures are clear. Oh yeah, they'll bow their knee again, but it'll be too late. Romans 14:11. Every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess. We must bow before Jesus while we still can get credit. Pilate was persistent. John 19, verse 4 through 6. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing Him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in Him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw Him, they should have turned their heads in horror at the bloody mess, satisfied with the torture unleashed on their innocent enemy, but no. They cried out, saying, "Crucify Him! Crucify Him!" These Jews were a bloodthirsty lot. I'm reminded of the self-righteous mob of John 8 that surrounded the woman caught in adultery like vultures circling their prey. The tens of thousands of lambs sacrificed in Jerusalem that week did not spill enough blood to satisfy them. They had to have this lamb's blood, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. The scribes and Pharisees in John 8 were convicted by their conscience when Jesus challenged them with, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." The Jewish leaders felt no such compunction on this day. Pilate said to them, "You take Him and crucify Him, for I find no fault in Him." John 19, beginning with verse 7, the Jews answered Him, "We have a law, and according to our law, He ought to die because He made Himself the Son of God." They knew exactly what Jesus was saying. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." They spoke up for the Roman emperor who was worshipped as a god over the Messiah who was truly the Son of God. John 19, verse 14 through 16. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. Luke 23:24 reads, "So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will." This morning, our study is really not about the verdict of the crowd, the chief priests, or Pilate. It's about your verdict. What is your verdict? Several statements and questions in this account are relevant to us. Pilate frames well the great question we must all ask in Matthew 27:22. What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? There's no question where the chief priests and the Jewish mob stood. What about you? What will you do with Jesus? Crown him or crucify him? Which will it be? Which has it been? The life you live down here says either I crown him or you crucify him. Have you crowned him king? Have you submitted to his authority? He certainly earned your wholehearted devotion. Hebrews 5:8-9. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all, listen, who obey him. Matthew 27:24. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." Pilate did not cleanse himself from guilt, despite his declaration of innocence. He did not cleanse himself from responsibility, and neither can you. Matthew 27:25. And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." They had no idea what they were saying. Mark 15:15. So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus to be crucified. This is the issue. Often when we clamor by the life we live to crucify Christ instead of crown him, we want to gratify the world. We want to go along to get along, please the others. What about you? Stay with us for a final word after our song. If you ask me why my heart is light and beats in my soul, it's because of Jesus. It's because of Jesus. Chains of sin are gone. I have a song that angels cannot sing. It's because of Jesus. Thank you for watching Let the Bible Speak. For a free DVD of number 892, The Verdict, call our 800 number or the address on our screen. We offer our monthly newsletter as well as our LetTheBibleSpeak.com you can go to watch videos or read transcripts of the program at your convenience. Finally, we echo the sentiment of the Apostle Paul. He wrote in Romans chapter 16, verse 16, "The churches of Christ salute you." Until next week, goodbye and God bless.